Thank you, Alex, and welcome. This is session 2.7 for the SRHE conference. My name is Rob Cuthbert. I'm chairing this session, and we have 3 sets of presenters. I'm aiming to keep us strictly to time if I possibly can. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce Adam Matthews and Charlie Davis to make the first presentation. Form and function of fiction as inquiry, a design heuristic framework. Go for it.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone, for coming to our session. So Charlie and I today are going to talk about a design heuristic framework for educational fiction. We're going to talk about a couple of projects that we worked on to actually do some of this stuff. And this piece of work is a reflective piece on doing some of the work to try and help others to frame their own work. But we've not just drawn on our experience; we've also drawn on a bunch of literature in cultural studies and other places, and we've tried to draw that together. So, in essence, what we're trying to do with this is, in the theme of the conference, is talk about knowledge production and dissemination. As a process and a framework, and that includes kicking back against particular canonical forms of knowledge or knowledges that we can just disagree with, right? So this framework of having dissenting voices within media and fiction, we think is a useful way of going about that. And today we're going to talk about that framework as a methodology with which to do that. So straight off, there is the framework, and our presentation today is really going to break that down. So I'll briefly talk about it now, but as I say, we'll talk about it as we go through. Charlie will talk about some projects we've done some work in comics. I think I just want to say straight out front, we're not just all about comics. That is just one form and medium that we think can be used for education fiction, and this is what this framework will try and do. So the top and the bottom, we've got form and function. So there's centuries-long arguments about which should come first, form or function. The modernist movement said form follows function, but we think the form of the fiction, the medium and the genre is really, really important. The medium being the more physical infrastructure and the genre being the more socially constructed. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And the function of what something is, what is the function of what you're trying to do? That's really important, but not the only thing. And there's a clear relationship between form and function, but also the making of the fiction and the decoding of it. So what goes in, whose voice gets into making the thing, what skills are needed, but also the decoding and sort of drawing on reception theory from cultural studies. What do people make of it when they get it? So there's a kind of an agency structure thing here. We're saying no one's really in control of a pure message, but we're using this to kind of trouble that, to help people to create educational fiction, but also to analyze it from a research perspective.
Just to give you a bit of background about where this work's coming from, Adam and I have basically submitted an article to this special issue, which we hope is working its way through the review system. And it was really an opportunity for us to pull together all our thoughts around educational fiction and the use of media as part of that. And that essentially is what we're going to talk to you about today. So it's really, as Adam has said, a reflection on where we're at and how we've arrived here. So as he said, it's not only about comics, but it is about comics as well. So Adam and I met a few years ago now, 2021, on a project exploring the transitions into and through academia by academics of working class backgrounds. And it was through that we started really exploring the possibilities of education fiction. At the time, I didn't know such a thing existed. I was aware of fiction existing in educational settings, but as a term and as an idea about how to do things, it was something I wasn't aware of. But through that comic process, we started to look at other ways of working with data from the research that we were doing to create media artifacts that were basically using verbatim stretches of transcripts and also using the ideas within the discussions that we were having to create representations of our lived experiences. And Adam's also done work around, and Rummage 2050 and beyond has looked at this idea in educational fiction that was tied up with it is this notion of speculative futures, and that very much informs Adam's work in this piece around looking at what a university might look like in the 2050s, but also working with concepts of what the university is for, who the university is for, and looking at how that might shape what's to come.
And just to add to that, Charlie, so that piece of work, it formed really an allegory in the end. So I've done some work around 3 modes of a university, and I created 3 characters that embodied those 3 modes, and they're basically having an argument in a meeting. So it's to show this kind of speculative future in a kind of a sort of a comical way, but a non-comical way as well. So if you're interested in seeing a meeting that you've probably been in a few times yourself in a university, go and have a read of that.
I think around the time we were starting to write the article and think about it, we both listened to an episode on Neil Selwyn's Meet the Education Researcher with Professor Sally Power from the University of Cardiff, and she was talking about the need for a descriptive turn in education because she has foreseen a crisis in education research, and essentially, I think in that podcast episode and the paper that accompanies it, in a simplistic, basic way, she was reflecting on the extent to which education research is meeting multiple audiences, and also thinking about in the past where education researchers occupied very privileged positions owing to this, their sort of very specific sort of niche skills and knowledge that's now being diminished with organizations such as schools being able to access data on their own and being able to do a lot of that work that education researchers did. So that sort of in some senses the landscape of education research is changing, and she's arguing that we need to do more to actually move beyond just simply looking for causal relationships as would exist in the natural sciences or the more sort of positivist, post-positive spaces, and arguing that actually what we need to do is start describing the world to people and telling people what is happening. I'm not going to read the sort of quote on the slide, but here you can see examples of that sort of crossover between ethnographic work and what happens in the social, the public imagination in terms of what's depicted in the media. So in the United Kingdom, over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen lots of programs in the TV where they go into schools and they follow people around, and you get a real sense of what's happening in the school, or with the lives of children, where we have educational psychologists looking at how children develop in certain situations, and this very powerful descriptive mode is something that is blurring the lines, I think, between educational research and what happens in the public imagination. And other examples of that, you can really see fiction and dramatization being used on television and in other media to really highlight societal issues, and particularly to and sort of indicate where there have been egregious forms of social injustice in the UK in the recent past. Mr. Bates versus the Post Office has been it was a program that brought to the fore of the social imagination the plight of sub postmasters that for years were basically punished by the law, in some cases imprisoned because of an error with a computing system, and they took the blame for shortfallings and monies coming out of their post offices, and nobody would believe them. But when it hit the TV screens, then that suddenly created a sense of what this injustice was, and we saw movement on how this actual form of social injustice was dealt with. And then the other thing that comes up time and time again is this idea, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, around what's true, what's fiction, what's not true. And this, I think, in a period of history that we are situated in, when there's so much in the news about post-truth, mistruths, and and a whole raft of things questioning whether or not we can actually believe things anymore, particularly coming out of the mouths of politicians, that we find ourselves asking, well, what is a true story? And this is again another example of a program that made it onto TV in the UK recently, and there was a bit of controversy around this because the program claimed this is a true story, and subsequently investigations in the media highlighted that there were actually parts of this that were very questionable. But it illustrates how in I think all aspects of our lives where we talk about fiction, there's an assumption that it's possibly not true, but the reality is quite often fiction is grounded in somebody's truth somewhere. And I think this is a point that Yuval Noah Harari is making, that the lines between what is truth and what is lying is particularly become very blurred in the times that we're living in, and that actually telling fictional stories is only a form of lying when you pretend that the story is true. So if we go back to Baby Reindeer, there's questions over actually the factual accuracy of a lot of what was said in it. But I think the most important thing that we found through our work, and looking particularly at literature in and around education fiction, which speaks to the second part of this quote from Harari, is the sense that actually the purpose of education fiction is to, as Neil Selwyn and his colleagues talk about, is to provoke and prompt discussion about the worlds that we're living in and the everyday experiences that we're having, and also the educational futures that we imagine, rather than to prophesize about them. So there's that sense there that through our work, what we hoped that it would do was open up more spaces for people to have those discussions and to think about creating new meaning through that intersubjective dialogue that took part between them, and not necessarily saying this is true, it's not true. So one of the ways that we did that was using composite narratives, where we took different threads of people's experiences and we wove them together into stories that represented experiences that hopefully would resonate with people and prompt them to tell their own stories.
And back to our framework. So to do all of this, going back to form, function, encoding and decoding, as Charlie says, we drew heavily in and talked about this quite a lot in what we've done in our own work, but then we wanted to draw on other work as well. And that's come from cultural studies. I'm particularly proud of cultural studies because it was sort of invented in Birmingham. I'm from the University of Birmingham, I'm from Birmingham, and it's probably the most famous thing the University of Birmingham is known for, although it's got a very controversial history that it was closed down, but people are starting to talk about it a little bit more now. So watch this space, maybe it might come back. We drew on cultural studies because of its academic rigor, but also there was that real interest in fiction and the media and being critical about what was created, but also creating things. And they loved a diagram. Cultural studies did everything by diagram. So we've drawn on this heavily. I'm not going to go into each of the diagrams, but Stuart Hall's encoding and decoding was really, really important to us in terms of thinking about how the fiction is made, which people, you know, you watch Baby Reindeer or you watch Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, and whose voice gets put in there. There's lots and lots of content, but somebody somewhere's got to decide, but whose voice gets there as well. And there's frameworks of knowledge, there's relations of production, there's technical infrastructure, but also when somebody watches it, everybody watches that differently based on their own cultural context, the time of day that they watch it. So that was really, really important for us in terms of encoding and decoding to develop the framework. And this rumbled on. The more you talk about this to people who are in cultural studies, they will say, "Ah, yeah, we know another diagram." And the Wendy Griswold from the 1990s talked about the creator and the receiver, very similar to encoding and decoding, but then the relation to the social world and the cultural object. Stuart Hall and colleagues developed a representation diagram around this as well, so that moved things on even more. Helen Wood in 2024 in a book called Audience adds form, interestingly, to that diagram. So we see our work as being a kind of a development of this kind of diagram. And there it is, just to remind you again of what we're doing. So encoding and decoding, as I say, is really, really important to us. There's a lot of complexity to it, but in terms of research and making it, it really makes you think when you create something, what should go in here? I am making a really, really important editorial decision, but also the skills in making something like that. I've talked about encoding and decoding quite a bit, but also form and function. So the form of the thing that you're making is really, really important as well. So we've done stuff in comics, we've done short stories. If we had the budget, we could do a feature film, right? So it depends upon what you have, but the medium of a form is important as well. So the technical infrastructure, if you've got a camera, if you've got recording equipment, that will produce something, that will produce a physical thing that has its own affordances and its own limitations and opportunities. And we want to be as inclusive as possible here, because an obvious barrier to entry is, having a huge amount of technical infrastructure to create a film or a book. Or we're not saying that. We're saying this could be used pedagogically as a short story, or you could, if you had the budget and funding, and maybe we will one day, to create something, Hollywood style film. So medium is a very fixed thing, is what I'm saying. Genre is much more fluid and much more messy, and speaks to what Charlie was talking about there. In terms of genres have this, if you think of the word genre, we think of fiction and non-fiction, but they do things themselves, just like the physical infrastructure does things. If you watch a docudrama, you sort of know it's a representation of reality, but with a sort of a creative tint to it. If you read an academic journal article, you know it's going to be very academically rigorous. If you watch news and TV, the lines are starting to blur, and this is a long revolution of 24-hour news. If you watch, I don't know, GB News or Fox News or Guardian TV or whatever, you're getting a sort of a political angle. So I think genre is this really fluid thing that is solid in some ways, so it gives the viewer a clue as what they're seeing, but also we have to be very responsible to play within those genres sometimes to make it clear what we're doing.
5 minutes, guys.
5 minutes, right? So I'm going to move on now just to talk about function and the function of education research, education media fiction, how we envisage it. Again, based on our own experiences of doing it, and also sort of reading up about it as well. So again, thinking about the function here, we're reflecting on the process and also what is output at the end of it, because we don't see the two of them as being separated in the sense that one can exist without the other. And for us, the process of creating education fiction was the opportunity to work together with each other and think about imagining possible futures and what they look like based on our own experiences and also the experiences of the research that we were carrying out, and also looking at what other people were talking about. And I think about the comics is the reflections on what people were saying about the existence of academics of working class heritage, and the different nuanced experiences that reflected in terms of people's transitions into higher education. And I think it's something that Adam said, go back a slide, Adam, as Adam was saying as well at the beginning, it was an opportunity to unsettle canonical views, to open up this opportunity for different perspectives to come through, and to actually work, next slide, in this sense of incompleteness, and thinking about incompleteness not as something that communicates an absence or that something is missing, but also is rather thinking about that as the possibility of thinking about things in different ways and developing meaning in ways that emphasizes the point that nothing's an absolute, and that things are constantly shifting, and as they shift, we are shifting in terms of how we see things and how we think about things. And a concept that we brought to bear on this, and one that we're exploring further, is this idea of conviviality. So at a very basic level, this notion of togetherness and living with difference to think about mobilities and to think about the way that we transition into and through spaces and the way that affects the way that we see the world and our ways of acting, thinking and being, and the possibilities of education fiction to foster a convivial process, but also communicate a sense of conviviality as well.
I've talked about encoding and decoding quite a bit already, but I'll just talk about it in the context of what was Charlie was talking about there in terms of this conviviality. There's a risk with conviviality that we sort of show this picture of everyone agreeing what goes into the making of thing, and everybody agreeing when they watch it. We want to totally dismiss that and say there can be room for disagreement at the encoding and decoding stage, and we would encourage that disagreement in terms of that living with difference. And the thing when you're creating a fiction, you can amplify personalities and characters, and we've done that in all of our work to show examples of that. You can create an argument and a discussion between people that you can't necessarily create if we're talking about true fiction. So we can amplify and show examples of two sides of a particular story. With encoding and decoding, as we said, it's two sides of our framework. What brings all of this together, what we've talked about today and what we've used, is the concept of an affordance. So an affordance is, again, it takes something, but everybody takes something that has a different affordance from that fiction. So what we want to try and say is, if we bring together the idea of an affordance that has the same material properties, everyone can take this in different ways. They can take it different ways in creating a story, but they can take it different ways in watching or reading or interacting with a story that shows that some of these differences, which can create robust discussions and disagreements, but convivially we want people to open those things up and to discuss them. And as that quote says there, it comes up with multiple outcomes potentially. We don't need to do that again.
Perfect timing, Adam. Charlie, thank you very much. We are open to questions and suggestions, but haven't seen any popping up in the chat yet. And we're still missing our third presenter, who is in southern Florida. So it may be that she's going to join us at the last minute, but I may just allow a little bit longer than we might otherwise have allowed because we have a bit more time. So can't see any hands up yet for questions. Just let me start then, if I can. I get it. I get where you're coming from, but it seems to me it might make any kind of communication extraordinarily problematic. Now, probably communication is extraordinarily problematic, but how do you kind of engage with that and confront it in terms of if everybody has a different affordance or something, then you know how is anybody getting anything like a common message and a robust discussion, which is what you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think that comes with the making of the thing. So when we talk about encoding and the form, which I led on in that part of it, you've got a responsibility to let people know if this is a true story or this is a dramatization. So the baby reindeer one caused such a furore in the legal world because they started their Netflix drama saying this is a true story, which legally is wrong. It should have said this is based on a true story and this is a dramatization. So as authors, whether we talk about ourselves as academics or creatives, we have a responsibility to let the audience know. And the form and the genre really do that, because if you say your drama is a docudrama, there are some sorts of truth in it. So the post office story in the UK, it happened, right? There was loads of news articles, there was academic work on it, but nobody really took any notice. It went on a mainstream TV channel to be dramatized for anyone to take any notice of it. So I think it's a good question, Rob, and I think there's a huge amount of responsibility because you can, I think there's almost a U shape here when we get into sort of post-truth, postmodernism, where you can start to get into Trumpian fake news, where you just say to everybody, we've got our own personal truths and that's the end of it and we're never going to get on. What we want to try and do is be totally upfront and clear to say these are fictional ideas, but we're throwing them out there as futures. We would have, if we had one longer, we probably would have talked about futures theory a little bit more in terms of the futures cone, where we look at possible, probable futures, where you can sort of talk about, well, if we go along the same trajectory where we're going now, we might end up writing an Orwellian dystopia maybe, or we might talk about other potential futures. So I think there's a depth to this that you have to be really careful with. Charlie, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, I've nothing to add. No.
We're still open to questions and discussions, but I'm just going to carry on if nobody else wants to come in. Yes, but I would say surely what a lot of fiction is aiming to do is to encourage a particular kind of decoding, so that you develop, you identify and have a different perspective from the one you started with, and that obviously will be very relevant in terms of teaching and learning, I guess. But I didn't quite get that from what you were saying. I may just.
Well, I think when you said a particular kind of fiction, sort of hits the nail on the head. I think we're developing a new genre here, not us particularly, but in the world of research, fiction and speculative fiction is becoming a genre in itself, and we have to be quite attuned to this. So, Rummage 2050 and Beyond that I wrote, it's in an academic journal. It's in an academic journal because if I had just put it out there into the world, I wouldn't have got any citations or any credit for it, right?
Yeah.
But it's a story sitting in there, so there's a danger. I think it's pretty clear that it's a story, but there's a danger that we're using a form and function of an academic journal that is not that feels wrong. So I think we have to develop a genre within academic work to be speculative, to say we're going to write a story about this and we're being really clear about it. And that can draw upon academic research. So as I said, in Rummage 2050 and Beyond, I use 3 modes of a university as a theoretical model, but they become characters, and I'm quite clear about that. In the comics, we use very traditional academic focus groups, story circles to get the data, but to write the stories, we write them between ourselves. So I'm sort of talking myself into this being in an academic journal all the time, right? Which I think we have to be careful with. As you develop a new genre, it can slip into a genre. So a genre is socially constructed. So you can slip into it. You can slip into everything being podcast. Everything could be a podcast now, right? Because they're so popular. They've swung US elections potentially, but they become interviews then. So you've got to be careful with the form and the function, I think. But it's a really good point, Rob, I think, in terms of people need to understand what they're getting, and we need to sort of solidify that. Maybe certain journals need to do it and have a different way of depicting it. So I think it comes under a commentary in the one I wrote. So, of course, working with publishers, the journals have got, commentaries, research articles, book reviews. Maybe we need another classification for that, possibly, but that's all up for grabs.
Yeah, and Sanchez just come in with a question, which is very much following on from that thing. How the multiple affordances discussed, where does the discussion happen? Is it important for a reader to know the other perceptions?
Yeah, that's. I don't want to take over, Charlie. You can come in a second. I think this is really interesting in terms of sort of education technology. We always hear about participation, right? We have to record what everyone has done, a bit like social media. Now, I'm quite comfortable with throwing something out into the world and letting it go. And there are a lot of people that aren't. So I think there's that opportunity of speaking back, which social media and interactive elements give us. But that needs to be designed in. You can't just do it and just think about it in the secondary. The comment below the line in newspapers. I think we've almost got to a stage where it's just become just not a very nice place to be. So I think you have to be careful with that, with the discussions and how they develop. And I think you have to design it in. If you were working with this as a pedagogy in the classroom, in undergraduate or postgraduate education, it's really nice that you can develop a fiction, a story, with the underpinning academic work behind it, present it to a class and we can discuss it. Putting it out into the world is a different matter, I think, and I'm not 100% sure I'm that keen on doing that, but you have to design it in that way. You'd have to have the infrastructure to do that. Charlie, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, because you're keen on using this as a pedagogy.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about what we did with the comics and when we put it out there. It's a hard one because it's got a spatial dimension to it, isn't it? We start talking about classrooms, we start talking about spaces that have sort of very, very often very clear dimensions, and in terms of what's expected to happen in them, it's dictated by curricula, etc. But when we put the comics out there, what happened was that people came back to us and said, and it actually prompted them to reflect on their own experiences. So if we bring it right back to the story, the idea of the story prompts other people to tell their own stories or to think about their stories. And so I'm not sure if to go back to what Rob was saying about encouraging decoding, I think you can't just write anything. You can't put anything out there. There has to be something there that resonates with a particular genre or a particular approach, but that allows people to write their own stories. So it's been a long time since I looked at the work of Jerome Bruner, which I looked at for my thesis, but this idea of sort of, he borrows, I think it's from Roland Barthes, the idea of writerly stories, that there has to be enough in it that presupposes that people will have some sense of what's going on, but it gives them the opportunity to think about their own stories, and to think about their own experiences. And that's, we often end up, and I think we looked at a lot of the work around encoding and decoding, and when they tried to roll it out to look at sort of the experiences of TV audiences back in whenever the 80s and the 90s, and they found that actually they couldn't come up with anything conclusive because people were arriving at different assumptions of themselves. The other thing for me is that, is it important for a reader to know other perceptions? I'm not sure entirely get that, but I think, again, coming back to the comics, one of the things that prompted that particular project was a worry on my behalf that while spaces were opening up to allow people opportunities to talk about how they've been underrepresented or how they've been excluded from things, that even within those spaces certain ideas and narratives were taking hold that limited the possibilities of other people speaking or other people sharing their experiences. So in that sense, I think, yes, it's really important to have those different perceptions and to bring them in, so that we don't end up living in epistemic bubbles or worse, echo chambers where only certain perceptions of reality get shared.
I think having things as shared experiences are important. So if we look into film and TV and fiction, people talk about things, right? And the docudramas that have developed, they become social things that people talk about, and people talk about. We've moved away from a monoculture where everyone would watch the same thing on TV and talk about it the following day. I think there's two sides to that. That yes, we've lost that, which in some instances is a shame. But we shouldn't look too nostalgically at that, because we have a huge amount of other stuff that we have access to now. That bringing people together, I think it's a really good question. Bringing people together is important to discuss some of these things. Because as I was saying, you can say things through characters that you wouldn't necessarily say yourself, or you wouldn't say them in a research environment. You wouldn't report it. So you can throw it out there and people can discuss it. And one thing I was just going to come back on there is a question about this. Are academics the right people to do this? And I think it's a very valid question. I think there's probably, because people are doing it very, very well and have done over centuries. And I think we have to think about the academic role. And I think the academic role is to bring in that research rigor to say, well, there is a huge literature base about this stuff. Can we help to bring it to life in some way? Which depicts that through a theory or through an idea. So I think there's probably a collaboration with media producers at that encoding stage to be those kind of critical ideas and thoughts when you're making this thing, and bring this kind of thinking to that. So yeah, thanks for the question. It's good to have a bit more time and space to think about this.
Right, and we may even come back to this. As I say, if our third presenter doesn't show up soon, then we may have a little bit more time if you want to at the end to sort of follow this through a bit more. But I'm going to move now to Sancha de Burka from Kent, and she's going to provoke us with a bit of luck.
I hope to. I'm not sure if I will with this. Right. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Because I saw something that said it. Okay.
Yeah, no, we're okay.
You're okay. Okay. Right. Okay. So let's get rid of that. Sorry. Yeah, so I'm Sancha de Burka, and I'm going to talk about activism through transformative experiences, because I had one myself and realized that I couldn't keep teaching unethical stuff. And I think there's quite a lot that I'm going to say that picks up on what has just been said. So things about affordances and shared experiences and stuff. So hopefully we can see the connections. Oh, hang on, it's not moving forward. Hold on a minute. I've just got to see if I can get my screen to actually work. Right. Hopefully that will work now. See if I can actually move it on now. That's it, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so the context of what I'm going to talk about is that I was implementing an experimental pedagogy that was trying to help undergraduate graphic designers from the University of Kent, but I have to say they weren't studying at the actual Kent campus, they were studying elsewhere, helping them to move towards ethical agency and social activism in re-seeing their design practice as an ethic of care rather than one of consumeristic design. So I worked in a very specific context, which is, very similar to the media context that we've just looked at. So why do we need to change design was the first question. And that's because design is very complicit in many of the world's wicked problems. I didn't list the wicked problems because I thought other people would probably be mentioning them quite a lot. Graphic design in particular came into being at the turn of at the time of the Industrial Revolution, when there was a lot of mass-produced goods that needed to be shifted. So it came into existence simply as something to persuade people to buy. And in doing that, it helped normalize consumerism. And this has resulted in consumerism being the best education there is. It teaches people better than anything you can do in a class. And it has also become an indicator of self-worth. It also is implicated in things like climate change, species extinction, because it sells the idea of infinite commercial growth through the abuse of the world's finite resources. So according to Tony Fry, who's a design educator and researcher, he has said that design needs redirecting towards a process of futuring rather than remaining in the current defuturing state. So design already has a huge history of activism. It's always contentious. It has been for, centuries. It questions or disrupts the norms, and it calls for change. And it also works for the disadvantaged, excluded or neglected. And I think that was really important for wanting to use it to shake up the teaching of design, to move away from the kind of unethical aspects of it. And graphic design relies on aesthetics to challenge the relationship between people's actions and feelings, which is also what I wanted to do within the classroom. Meanwhile, higher education says, Solbrecky and Sugru say that higher education should enable citizen learners to evaluate continuously and negotiate the core concepts of their profession, which made higher education a really good space for this piece of activism. So rather than just kind of rushing into the classroom and throwing kind of activism around, I wanted to make a framework that was going to be helpful for actually designing the curriculum and also testing it. So I turned to Kevin Pugh's model of teaching for transformative experiences. Pugh says that there are 3 elements in a transformative experience. One of them is expanded perception, which breaks a paradigm and helps people to re-see the world slightly differently. And that's the key point, and that's why activism is helpful. But there has to be experiential value for that re-seen content. And it's experiential value that turns out to be the glue that holds all this together. When someone re-sees the world, their paradigms are usually ruptured, if not completely broken. And they look around to test what else they could do to put in this space. So that leads to free choice action, which is what I was aiming for in terms of the student agency to be wanting to use ethics of their own free choice. So as I say, this provided a good framework for both designing the interventions, but also testing to see how successful they were by looking at each strand separately and then seeing how they fitted together. So I asked really overall, in what ways are transformative experiences effective? Do they promote ethical agency when that's what you're trying to do? And how do participants perceive transformative experiences relating to this? What do they think about their own experiences in this pedagogy? So the actual design of the education was that it was mainly based around critical pedagogy. That was generally a critical pedagogy of design, but that would also lead to critical pedagogies of all kinds of other things, because design is sort of intertwined with our whole way of life. But critical pedagogy, especially when the students come in very invested in a subject they love, you don't want to just blame them for being both designers and also consumers. That's a sort of double whammy. You don't want to kind of destroy their use of design, because the affordances of design can actually be used for, for good very well. So I underpinned all of this with a pedagogy of critical hope, which was there to help build the experiential value. And that was in particular for students to take part in small pieces of activism, to research it, to look at case studies, and to share this amongst themselves. And this actually was found to increase their self-efficacy, because they could see that they didn't have to change the whole world in one fell swoop, which is impossible to do, but they could change or attempt to make change in small places through their designs. And also, in order to sort of, help promote their agency, the pedagogy included building experiences that were very different, both inside and outside of the classroom, and opportunities for them to work with others and take on risk, and things that were at stake the whole time. And all of this was underpinned with Lather's theory of catalytic validity, which says that if you have participants in a research project, it works okay. It's not unethical if that taking part in that research conscientizes them, and this benefits both them and people that they might work with. So the actual projects that we implemented, one of them was called Design Volunteers, and this sent the students out of the classroom to be paired each with an individual charity. So each student had a different charity, and they worked with those locally across the best part of their second year. And that taught them not only client skills and relationships, but it also showed them that design and activism in design could be used for social purposes, not just sort of consumeristic purposes. So that actually gave them an experience of actually doing that for real in the real world, design that was used. We also had a range of projects, including some from live briefs. Real clients came in, and some of them were focused on ethics, some were focused on environmental awareness or sustainability. But we didn't feel that we could do every single project, at least my colleagues in particular didn't feel that we could do every single project sort of focusing on this topic, because for 3 years, people would just get sick of it. It was overkill. People had come in because they wanted to do branding and they wanted to do magazine design and all the rest of it. So in order to still ensure that even when they were doing what you might call a normal project, that it was still crucial to think about ethics and sustainability, I designed a set of evaluations that would ask the students to look at their professionalism, their ethics, and how sustainable they'd been, and other things, alongside their developing design practice. And this was really an important part, it turned out to be a really important part of the project, because the students themselves, actually showing some agency here, brought these evaluations back to the start of each project as a kind of preemptive checklist. And they weren't just, looking at them at the end, and they were actually using them to enable their own ethics and their practical wisdom about ethics at the outset. But the main project that I'm going to just show you some information about was one called Project X. It was a placeholder name, and we had it every year. It was about half a term in length. And this was always about usually about some social issue, always a big competition of some sort. So the one that I'm going to look at most is Provoking Our Futures. And that was the students working as activists amongst the community to share how the future might be. So it ties in very much with the previous talk as well, this kind of what if, the possibility for how the future might plan out. And then the second year was working for the Creative Conscience competition, and the students chose their own topic in this one, and that was mental health. So the Project X design format was always starting with a critical activist introduction. It was quite harsh. This is where they had their sort of felt difficulties quite often, and there was quite often a lot of reluctance at first that was usually overcome. They had shared experiences of researching and taking part in activism, and they would usually then make a kind of display for the whole group to have a look at, so everything was shared. And they were making things like activist games that people could use to talk about the topics that they were working on. In Provoking Our Futures, we had 9 mixed year group teams. So we mixed up the whole 3 years of the degree. We mixed them up for peer scaffolding. And in the mental health project, we had 7 teams in mixed year groups. They worked in what's called a charrette or design-a-thon, which is a scaffolded format which kind of keeps the pace going of different parts of the process of design. So finding out what the problem is, researching it, then researching ideas and asking what if this happened. And there was a lot of activist teaching here, really, sort of provoking, what if it was like this, what if it was like that. It was, trying to get students out of the tram lines of normality and think about the potential. And then, cycles of design development. But the main event with both of these projects and future ones was that the students would work with the community. So either they would make a display and the public would come in and talk to them there, or they'd be pitching to members of the community. So this idea of working with and for the community was really the centre of the whole thing. So in Provoking Our Futures, the students were making activist pieces that are known as provotypes. These are speculative design, comes from the word provocative prototypes, coined by Ezio Manzini, a professor of design at Milan. So they're conversation starters that ask, what if? They are designed as research, but they're also designed as change making. And they're always important that they work with communities as well. But as you can see, some of them don't look like graphic design and some of them are quite weird. And in fact, a lot of speculative design is very strange, very sometimes quite aggressive, contentious. So it's design activism. And this one in particular is just one of many. This was the group that were working on how gardening might fit into sustainable futures. And this is seed bombs. These are seed bombs. So you wrap up the seeds in a degradable substance and then you toss them into unused lots where nice flowers or vegetables will grow. And it's not really that it changes the environment per se, or that it can do. It's more about getting the community to notice that there's wasted elements in the environment and stuff like that. So in the 4-day display in the canteen, of course, the community came in. It's a big organization and there was hundreds of people coming through. Each team set up their own little display and they were engaged in triggering conversations with the local community with a focus on feedback and how to produce ethical designs. And after that project, the team had a bit of a redesign. In the next project, the students had total autonomy on what project they worked on. So they nominated and then voted on, the cohort topic, which turned out to be mental health. So at that stage, we felt a little bit worried about, doing activism in this kind of arena without support. So we got in our own counselling team and members of national charities from their local branches. So they came in both as actual support for us and the students, but also for representing members of the community that the students would work with. It turned out to be designed for very familiar people. It was much more meaningful to the students than the Designing Our Futures one had been, because we found out that many of the students had mental health issues themselves, or they had people that their loved ones had mental health issues. So we needed that help from the experts, we thought. The scaffolding was the same with the SRHE format. Now, to look at these two events, I used a method called phenomenography, which is mainly used in education, not exclusively, but mainly, and you'll see why, because it fits so well. So it takes a snapshot of one given moment. I was using the student surveys and reflection sheets and blog posts post intervention to see where their perceptions of a given phenomenon, in this case, becoming professional graphic designer that is ethical. And it doesn't look at individual people. It looks at the variations that exist across the group. And you'll usually find there's about 5, 6, 7 variations in any set group about any set phenomenon. And then the outcome from that, which you map as a visual outcome space, which I'll show you in a minute, are used to design further interventions. So you can actually plot out, your cohort, where they actually sit in relation to that phenomenon that you're teaching for. It's usually used as a one-off snapshot, but I unusually used it for 2 years so I could compare the expansion of perception in particular across the 2 years. I should say as well that I was actually running a narrative methodology alongside this. So these are the two outcome spaces. I hope you can see them with the video part might overlaps part of it. So I've put them there comparatively so that you can see how the activism in this pedagogy actually did change the expansion of perception. So if you look at the one on the left first, that's the one from the first example, and the one on the right clearly is the second year. So in the middle, you see a circle that says self, and that isn't any one particular self. That is just the way that a self, any given self, the perceptions are seen through the lens of the self, let's say. And that dotted line distinguishes between the inward focus and the outward focus behind the perceptions. So variation 1, the perception that's furthest from the phenomenon of professional ethical design, suggests that creating a design outcome was, being an ethical designer. So clearly missing the point quite a lot. Variation 2, it was creating a stylish design that promotes the designer's reputation. Again, missing the point. Variation 3, the perceptions here begin to see ethical design, but they're suggesting that being an ethical designer is using sustainable and ethical messages to promote the designer's reputation. So this is why they're inwardly focused. And it's not that I think they're necessarily selfish people or anything like that. I think it's to do with being a learner, being new to design, not maybe understanding what an ethical designer actually is compared to learning to be a designer. Over the line, though, where you begin to get an outward focus on the people that the profession should support, so you begin to see an ethic of care building here, is in variation 4, it's about helping others through clarity of communication and sustainable practices. At variation 5, it moves up a little bit closer to the phenomenon, where it expresses a moral need to proactively help others and thus avoid unethical negligence, which they meant was not harming the people. It wasn't a matter of like, I'll be in trouble if there's ethical negligence. It will be, people will be harmed if there is. And at variation 6, it changes again. So rather than just saying they need to sort of support and help people, it actually changes to an inherent ethical and egalitarian responsibility to empower others. So this is right up next to the being an ethical designer and working with the community. So a few people had actually perceived that. The majority were on their way towards that. In the second year, it was slightly different. You could see that there had been an increase of expansion of perception. I do have to say that although the majority of people were the same, they weren't all the same. Some people had left, obviously, and some people had come in the first year. But overall, it changed. It kind of swept up towards the educational outcome, the phenomenon. The first variation didn't exist at all anymore. And the other variations unsurprisingly, were still the same, but more people were actually involved in the variations in the top half. So 4, 5, and 6 still showed that same move between helping and empowering. And at variation 7, a few people, not many, the perception there was that they were recognizing the need for systemic change. And I think that came about partly through sustainability, but also partly through the fact that their own research into mental health showed that there was systemic lack, I think. So the results then...
Wind up, Sancha, in a minute. Give us a couple of minutes more and then we'll go for questions.
Fine. Yes, just got 4 more slides, very quick ones. Okay, so expanding perception did occur because students were reporting that it was eye-opening, not surprisingly, and that the felt difficulty that came with this expansion of perception, this breaking of paradigms, was needed. The people who didn't have that didn't seem to get as far up that chart as the people who did experience the jolt, and they could value it despite it. Working with the community and experts gave them a different point of view of design, so they came to really see purposes of design as less consumeristic and more ethical. In terms of experiential value, they appreciated the risk and consequences, especially when they overcame the challenges of nervousness or, you know, confronting people or whatever. And in terms of attaining skills and getting their design degree, it swapped from just, you know, a personal thing to being a kind of almost CPD approach, so that they were looking for new skills and using ethics in order to help people. So they saw the social purpose of design, gave it more depth and added value, which to me was something really important, because I was glad that I had actually helped them like it better and not destroy their love for it. This slide could have gone on for about 5 slides. It was absolutely amazing the amount of stuff they did. They became ethics evangelists. They were trying to convert everybody at work, at home, everywhere, other classes. And they were, in their design practice that I could see in the studio, they were using preemptive ethics, and they were kind of policing each other as well. They usually had a preference for activist kinds of topics where there was a potential for a self-initiated project. And they were also taking personal actions towards this, which is something that, you know, is beyond my remit as a tutor. But they were changing their practices of consumption, and they were taking, you know, carrying out actions like not buying new things just because they wanted to. They were taking their families to beach cleans, and they were also quizzing employers about their own ethics before they would agree to work for them, which I thought was quite bold of people who hadn't actually graduated yet, but you know, they were doing it. So the last slide then, so my recommendations are, if you want to do activism in the classroom, which I would obviously encourage everyone to do, the teaching for transformative transformative experience model is really helpful in kind of giving it a framework and making it more controlled, let's say, such a thing as controlled activism, I don't know. Taking part in experiences that are real and meaningful also is really important. It's not something you can just sit and learn. You have to actually go out and do it. And the experiences have to be kind of consequential, with risk and things at stake, as far as you can do in the, you know, the parameters of health and safety and ethics in education, obviously. Getting the community in and co-designing, being outward facing, being compassionate, that's absolutely crucial. And I think definitely take a critical activist stance and present difficult content to your students. But if you do that, use critical hope as well, through things like a local focus and attainable actions and case studies, so that they're not lost. So thank you. Any questions?
Fabulous. Are there any questions? I haven't seen any coming through on the chat yet. I must admit that art and design is generally unfamiliar to me, but every time I go into an art and design faculty, I'm really struck with the sense of student engagement and connection, you know, which is not something you always get in other parts of a university very often.
It's probably because it's practical. Most of it's practical work, I think.
Yeah, but you sound as if you were almost too successful in encouraging ethical activism, as it were. You know, they really.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's a fine line, especially in something like a mental health project.
Yeah.
You know, in education. So we obviously made some, adjustments to if people wanted to sit out, if anything was too true, because a lot of the students have, I mean, some of the histories that they'd encountered didn't end well. So it was, it was quite difficult. But I think that compassion came out, and loads of the students were saying they learned about themselves as well as about others. So that was a really successful project. So
Yeah. I can see Mariko's got a hand up, so I'm going to go. Mariko, far away.
Yes, thank you so much, Rob. And Sancha, thank you so much. It was a fascinating presentation of a very creative educational intervention. I really enjoyed it. I mean, especially appreciated the visualization, how the students started to develop, right?
yes, yeah.
Aesthetics focused, their own design focused activities into the ethical realization and awareness. How did you measure the students, the changes? And how is that represented in that visualization?
So the visualization I had on was just looking at the expansion of perception. So the phenomenography across the 2 years was just looking at that element of expansion of perception. So as the students graduated, and also sometimes some second years, I also performed a lot of semi-structured interviews. And in those interviews, I also had things like journey mapping, which is a thing that designers use in their practice to see the pain points along someone's history with the design. So I was asking them to plot on what were the highs and lows of their past 3 years. And it was quite amazing that most of the highs were when they were actually engaged in activism, and most of the lows were their prior courses where they didn't do any, or where they missed an opportunity to do some activism. And that was kind of really rewarding, but also quite, I didn't expect that necessarily. I thought they might say something was boring or, something like that. But no, it was like, getting in to do it. So I think it was very active kind of curriculum and very much engaging the students. And, like Adam and Charlie said, it was very much about what they wanted to interpret and what they wanted to do. There was lots of space for them to pick their own stuff, their own topics and things, so they could do meaningful topics. And I also measured through those interviews, I was measuring the value, where the value was, how it increased, and what agency they did. So I looked at I looked at everyone's story, but I kind of wrote up a few particular people's stories, because it sort of turned out there were strands or bands, if you like, of how people reacted to it. And that was mainly based on their past experience. So that's why it was really important to give them experiences, because that would sort of help them kind of climb up the ladder, if you like, to nearer to the outcome.
Thank you, Sancha.
Yeah, well.
We have one or two people joining and leaving at the moment, which is fine. Just to explain that it looks like our third contributor, Karen Ramlakan, is not going to join us. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm very happy to continue with more discussion on Sancha and indeed on Adam and Charlie's presentations. And I think there's some mileage in there as far as we can see. But just to explain that for the people who have just joined us, thinking they might have heard the third contribution. But Sancha, there's a comment in the chat from Charlie. Say, you mentioned the students were policing each other. Did you take any steps to ensure that some people weren't imposing their will on others and shutting down opportunities for different opinions to exist?
Yes, I mean the whole curriculum was based around really the fact that I won't be there when they're when in their career, when they're doing they're facing any new problems, because they were all young and I'm not. So it was very much about promoting sort of practical wisdom, so that they could judge any kind of context as it came up, and sort of figure out what was, you can't say something is ethical and something's not, because contexts change. So it was very much about them having this practical wisdom to be able to kind of assess a situated context of what would be the best thing to do in that context. And we never actually said, what is good, what is ethical. It was kind of left to people to decide. Of course, they would argue about it. We had lots of heated discussions. But in terms of them policing each other, it was more really in terms of if someone in the studio was about to waste paper or about to print, you know, it was very, very much on the sustainability lines. So in a way, the kind of easiest thing to deal with. So I think that also helped more people to kind of rise up those levels of getting nearer to the to what we were aiming for, to be more ethical, because they also knew that if they did waste paper or waste ink or leave the lights on, all those kinds of things, it would be kind of police. And the students weren't afraid to, you know, to me and my colleagues, they weren't afraid to kind of police us either. But there was never really any imposing a will on each other. When we had debates, they could get quite heated. So I started doing a thing of, we'd have something like a pen or a paintbrush that was the virtual microphone, and you could only speak when you had the microphone. And we were looking at things like worldviews and how your worldview might colour your ethics, maybe. So it was quite open, and it was always a good place for debate, but I didn't really feel that anyone was being shut down, especially in their design. On the contrary, it seemed that people were really interested in each other's design, because a lot of the projects, they would be picking very, very different topics, and they were just interested in what they could do. So it seemed more that people were sharing. So the policing was more on the being sustainable in the studio, I would say.
Mm.
And there was another question, but I can't see it now.
There's more a comment from Adam, I think. So I don't know if he wants to develop it at all.
Oh, it was a bit of a waffle, I think. It was a question, I think. But, that was great, thank you. And I think there's loads of similarities, especially the prototype I thought was great. And I think that's what we tried to do with provocation. I was really interested in the course itself. So becoming a graphic designer, of course, there's all the stuff that you said about becoming a designer. But then there's that secondary stuff, which feels much more social sciencey, but I guess about more content. So I guess this must be a problem for a graphic designer anyway. You're dealing with content. That seems like a secondary thing. And it's sort of a flip to ours, in that we're taking it from first principle of being a social scientist, humanities scholar, and trying to translate that. But we don't have the skills. And of course, the obvious answer would be to work together. But was there anything, firstly, was there any kickback to that? But also, how did you fit it into the curriculum of being able to know enough about all the issues of ethics and all that kind of stuff? I think that's what I was saying anyway, if that makes sense.
Okay, so, well, there's so many things to pick out from that. So I might go off the track myself now. I mean, I'd always taught ethics, but it had always been more like, for example, if you as a designer you're taking a taxi and you're chatting, the designer says, the taxi driver says, oh, will you design me an advert, and I'll give you, I'll tell all my clients about you. It was the ethics of, no, don't do that. It's a paid job. Would he take people for free? If he would take you everywhere for free, it might be a good deal. So it was more like, or would you design for a cigarette company or a fur coat company? So it was more kind of things like that. So it kind of expanded into I mean, I think graphic design teaching in general, not everywhere, and I think it is changing, but it did used to be very technology based, I mean, as in logistics based. It was very much about, you need to learn typography, you need to learn drawing, you need to learn how to send something to the printers, you need to learn the software. So it does attract a lot of people who are very kind of fixated on software, but it doesn't teach you what is actually an ethical project to participate in, and whether you could refuse it and still keep your job. And it doesn't tell you at all how it's very much about commercial stuff, so advertising, branding, magazine design, posters, all of which are trying to get people to change their behavior. So those affordances of design, things like problem solving, collaboration, explaining complex information through visuals, they all seem to be geared towards selling stuff, and we can't do that anymore. So it was very much really about bringing in another set of design skills, which were basically ethics and care for the people. And there's quite a lot of stuff written out there about professionalism in general, which says that that's lost in the kind of way that higher education has become very accountable and a bit almost like a transaction. You know, you pay for your degree and you get your technical skills. That you need to bring in this lens of, I mean, ethics needs to be the first thing before any design. It's, you know, you'll do your design, but through the lens of ethics. And that's why I think people were sort of wanting to learn particular skills, not just because they wanted to learn them, but they'd sort of changed to be wanting to learn them so they could actually use them to help people. So I think, so it wasn't too, I mean, it was over time. I don't think you could do it in one project or even 1 year. So I think this length of time to show that this is the normal way of doing it now had to be something that you bring in. I think if you just did like one project on sustainability, it's meaningless. So did I answer? I can't remember to answer.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of where you do need to do a degree in this thing, because there's a lot of kickback now. So Skills England, all that sort of stuff. Or, you know, should everyone have to go to university for their profession? I think this is a great example. Over 3 years, you don't just learn the software. There's a huge amount of knowledge underpinned and ethical stuff around what you should and shouldn't do. And I think it's quite a nice kickback to the social imaginary of advertising and graphic design is almost Mad Men a little bit, I guess. Sort of what you were describing there. But there's also, and I always think of sort of factory records as being graphic design as well. So that's sort of social commentary. So I suppose, I think the example, you do need to do the degree in it because you can fit all that really interesting stuff in it. It's really, really important for society.
I think it's important as well that design, for all its kind of commercialism, has always had this, you know, the avant-garde side, which has always been kind of activist all the way through to things like Dada and things like that. So there's quite a lot of history you can call on to show people as well. And I tried to do that through methods that weren't going to allow me to be too directive, but to try and let the students kind of work it out for themselves a bit, because I know my weakness there.
Yeah, I mean, we're still open to questions. I mean, I mean, it's fine art that's usually at the very provocative end of art and design, I think. But I mean, I can. It seems to me that this is making sure that the graphic designers are just as engaged in the provocation as the fine artists almost always are, in my experience.
Yeah, we did actually look at. I mean, I don't make any distinction between art, design, media. It's all. Yeah. I mean, I did come from a kind of background of communication, so. So, you know, sort of the encoding and decoding is very, very up my street. But I mean, when they were actually researching the projects, I did encourage them to look at fine art activism. And we weren't just looking at sustainability or saving the planet. We were looking at anything that provoked and anything that worked in, you know, we were looking at some design that you would count as very unprovocative, nice, charming design that still gets a job done. There's a particular thing called the Palau Pledge. The island of Palau suffered from a lot of pollution of tourists making a mess, and they asked a design company to come and help them keep the tourists, but to stop the tourists making a mess of everything. And they just designed a pledge to the children of Palau. They just stamped in the passports of people entering, and they had to sign this pledge, a pledge to the children of Palau to protect their futures and stuff. So, you know, so that's not really provocative in the sense of activism, but it's change making in a kind of gentle kind of way. So we looked at those kinds of things as well. Not everything was in your face. There's some things were the opposite. So
yeah.
I've got another question.
Yeah, Adam.
I get it sort of flips for what I just said about the sort of advocating for what you're doing. Is there a kind of a potential for some kickback in a sort of a culture war scenario of people saying you're politicizing this?
Yeah.
And you could sort of see that coming in the Jaguar advert that we saw last week, all that sort of stuff. Is there anything, because I guess there's a danger that you could put a student in quite an awkward position potentially. Do you educate them about that, or is there anything around that?
Yes, I mean, this was a thing, and when I actually started the research and started the, changing the curriculum, I was really worried about kind of crossing those boundaries and being accused of, sort of dictating to the students and everything. But I kind of relaxed about that after a while, because they knew what I thought. I had a colleague that didn't necessarily think the same things. They knew what he thought. They knew what each other thought. So we kind of maintained a very permissive, open, everyone's opinions kind of counted, and made a point of looking at design from not just Western design, but all kinds of design, and people could pick projects and do that. So we were, but I was kind of worried, and that's why, did a very, very long ethics plan, and got other people involved. So like when we did the mental health, that's why I got the experts to come in to sort of help with that, because I was quite worried about the students' well-being, and about whether I was politicizing them. But I mean, our course had always been a kind of quite open place, so anyone could express what they wanted to do. And we actually found that the kind of most reluctant students to sort of consider ethics were nothing to do with their kind of political opinion, but when they were fixated on the digital side of stuff and couldn't see the point of ethics. They didn't, so that was quite a difficult, they were kind of difficult nuts to crack, if you like, because some of them just didn't want to. And if people didn't want to, there was nothing we could do about it. So we would never force them. And at that point, none of the learning outcomes of the modules spoke about any of this ethics or sustainability. We just kind of marked it under professional practice, and we made it quite clear you could get full marks without having to bother with this, which some people did, and the majority didn't. The majority came on board, but I say in these different levels, and it took time for people to move up the levels. So, and I think seeing the other students going that way made some people think this must be the way to go, and they kind of conflated that with what would be acceptable in the world. But really, they were ahead of the world, I think, in general, the design world. So
that's good. That's good to know.
Yeah.
We've got a quarter of an hour, so if people still want to use this time, we can go back to Adam and Charlie's presentation as well. I mean, I'm interested. I'm trying to connect this with the first plenary about decolonizing knowledge, and I could see with Adam and Charlie an immediate sort of route to doing that. I mean, what they were talking about was the way of doing that. Is it? How does graphic design work? I mean, it's a universal language in a sense, but is it? It's not, because you have to contextualize. You have to have a cultural understanding of the images that you're looking at, I guess. I mean,
yeah, and the thing with graphic design, I suppose it's the same actually with things like a graphic novel or a comic or something like that, is that it only works in a given context. You couldn't take one piece of graphic design and place it somewhere else. It only works in that given context. And there is the thing that, Adam and Charlie were talking about, that people will interpret it differently, which obviously I teach semiotics, so I was very keen to explain that the meaning is in your mind. It's not a set meaning, and what anyone places in their design can be misinterpreted. And it doesn't, and that was kind of shocking for them. That there was I said there's like no fixed meaning on anything. It's just what you interpret, which I think kind of made them have to sit down for a few months until they got used to it. So.
I think that's a really interesting point about universalism, and going back to medium and genre. So airports are a really good example of this, I think. So you go to an airport and everything is universal, right? But it's the genre of the airport. So know when you're in an airport, you're going to see that stuff. That was what I was going back to. This idea of genre is very flexible and fluid, but also very fixed. So if you're in an airport, you're expecting to see this stuff. You get it. That's our problem with speculative fiction in research and education. People don't expect it, so you've almost got to create the context for that. So I think that's really interesting. And I suppose, Sanjay, you've got the issue of modernist design that was there to save the world in the 60s, of being very powerful to say we can go and save the world, change all of this stuff, and then postmodernism kicked back against all that stuff and said, you know, it's not as possible as we think, and there's lots of other perspectives that could come into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And things go around in circles in art and design and media. They, you know, things come in and out of meaningful, I won't say fashion, a bit dismissive of fashion, but things come in and out of meaningfulness, I suppose, according to how we are in the world at that point.
Mm.
So I mean, this is, sorry, go on.
Oh no, sorry, go on ahead.
Okay, this is why I was trying to, I mean, I don't know if you noticed on the charts I had up, it said about techne, episteme and phronesis. This idea of, I didn't want to go into that in the slides as well, it was too much to bring in, but the idea of building that practical wisdom through having had experiences. Aristotle said that practical wisdom, phronesis, could only be developed through having experiences. That, you know, you'd never ask a young man advice. You know, that's what he said. I'm not saying that you wouldn't, because you have to have experiences, and that's why I was trying to embed so many experiences in a different ones, so that they would have this ability to be able to see what they needed to do in any given context, or try to do something in any given context. Not that there's a kind of rule book, because there isn't, and the rule book seems to get, you know, fatter but more useless every year. So that's why, you know, you there is no kind of universal thing in a way. It's more like I just need to weigh up this situation, this small design project, or the whole world. I need to weigh it up. Now, what's happening now?
Mm. Mm.
Were you going to come in, Charlie, on that?
No, I was going to ask a really boring question. Is sort of, you talk about critical hope, and sort of my limited understanding of that is that it's a sort of response to sort of naive hope, which is tied up in ideas of sort of meritocratic, competitive sort of striving to get ahead. Very much sort of a lot of arguments about higher education today is that, you know, with the economification of things, that it reinforces that idea of there's a desirable outcome, and if you do all of this, you'll get this. If you work hard, you get all that. And critical hope, to me, seems to be at odds with that way of thinking, because it's sort of proposing another way of acting, thinking, and being, which rejects that. So when it came to sort of designing what you were doing, did you have any problems at a curricular level, given the structures that are in place to, if you were being cynical, say, reinforce a naive hope?
I mean, I understood critical hope as not really being that. I mean, actually, there seems to be more in common with what you've just described than the critical, you know, naive hope is things like the X Factor syndrome. I just got an X Factor, I can be a star forever, or I will win the lottery, so I don't need to work hard, or something like that. Whereas critical hope is more looking at, well, what can we actually do? What can actually be done in this situation? And, you know, what can each person do, in, you know, given their resources or their, you know, their ability to, their affordances. And so it was much more like, I just need to know how I can move forward. So that's why we use a lot of case studies. So these case studies were designed, things like the Palau Pledge and things like that. But they were also pieces of art, pieces of design, and just, you know, I need to learn this skill. So they were kind of small, almost like jigsaw pieces in your schema of hope, if you like. So they were very practical things that you could employ, and kind of getting rid of this idea that any one person can change the world. You can only do what you can do. So that, you know, it was go with that, you know, what can I do now? Well, we'll do that. So it was trying to kind of maintain that ability to move forward, not to get paralysis with worry of the, you know, the hugeness of things, and not to sort of, and certainly not to sort of think there's going to be a technical fix, because, you know, a lot of the technology is what's got us here in the first place, or is, you know, making it easier to make things worse. So it was more like yeah, it was more like just, well, have a look at this case study, what can you do from this? So it was and I think also one of the students had reported to me that because I said we've got some, critical pedagogy coming now, but don't worry, there will be some, some alternatives, some hope afterwards. She said that she hung on to that, and she thought a lot of them did, and that, that was always delivered. So that was something that showed that it wasn't just kind of pushing people off the edge of a cliff, if you like.
Sancha, there's a question. Marika saying, have you published somewhere, because she wants to know more. So if you could put any links on the chat, that would probably be the best way to do it. I was struck by kind of resonance with, I mean, my favorite theory of university organization is organized anarchy, and from that I have, I mean, no, seriously, it's a serious proposition, and from that I have kind of the idea that the prime function of a university is to generate uncertainty and confusion about perspectives, so that you, and to help people work through that. But there's a concept within the organized anarchy sort of paradigm of sensible foolishness, which is it's sensible to have an idea of what you want to do and where you want to get to and what you're trying to achieve, and it's foolish to think you'll actually get there. Because there are so many things that might happen to you on the journey, and so those things resonate for me quite strongly, So that's another dimension. We're running short of time. Oh, thanks, Adam. Adam's put a thing on the chat about organized anarchy and foolishness. Yeah, good.
I was going to go about being a designer. There is that hope you've got to design something. So I suppose you were talking about holding on to that, because you can almost be frozen into doing nothing, I guess. So I think you've probably said this, haven't you? You have to sort of balance the sort of critical responsibility of a designer, who you've got to take into your own consideration, your own background and perspective on the world, but you've still got to do something. And did anyone freeze with that? Because I sort of do this in some of my work, where if you're teaching and you ask people to do something that pushes them outside of their comfort zone too much, they just sort of freeze and don't do it. And it's definitely a pedagogical problem that I have. I don't know if it feels like that you're striking a real close balance there with that.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to push people, because the situation that design is in, and therefore design students, that this double whammy of being both a designer, so therefore you're to blame, but also a consumer, therefore you're to blame. We wanted them to acknowledge that, but to rethink what design can be. So I think it's not even, as Rob said, it's not even so much of knowing that things will change you and change your aims, but it's kind of thinking about, I think, the purposes of stuff. And I think in particular with something like graphic design, and maybe business is another one. What is the purpose? What could be the purpose of that? It doesn't have to be just to kind of keep the world as it is, which is destroying itself. It could be to bring in new ways of doing and new means of seeing these things. So I think that kind of breaking down of the norms, in the sense of what are these things for, what's education for, and everything. I think those are the things that can be changed. And I think there was something that you said in your talk, I think, as well, about things never being finished. I actually had a slide that I had taken out because it was just too long, about design always being in beta. Even when you finish something, it's not really finished. You think you will probably have to change it in a few years. So not this idea that that something is fixed and that's it, but that everything is temporary, everything will change, which is quite philosophical, I suppose. So
this is a normal script for any PhD supervisor. You're never going to finish it, but you have to stop at some point, so
exactly. Yeah,
you have to end it, and sadly I think we have to end this discussion as well, because I'm under strict orders from the organizers not to overrun. So we are going to close. There's time for about one more comment if Adam or Charlie or Sancho want to say anything. It's been a fabulous discussion. Thank you so much to the presenters. Any last words from anyone? If not, we will close the session more or less now. People are bailing. Yep. Okay. Well done, everyone. Terrific discussion. Thank you very much indeed for both the presenters, all the presenters, all three. Great.
Rob. Cheers, Sanjay. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
guys.
much. Thank you,
See you
Sanjay.
soon.
Thank you,
Thank
Rob.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Alex.